Right, I'm going to take you to another conversation tonight. You might remember over the past few weeks here on eNCA we've covered protests in areas including Diepsloot. Just earlier I was telling you about demonstrations in Edumbe in KZN. The issues as always, crime, service delivery, a lack of jobs. You know, there's the water demonstrations recently ended in Kwakwa in the Free State, but there were fewer service delivery protests last year than in 2018. 217 protests were recorded last year, 20 less than the year before. That is according to Municipal IQ. They are a specialised local government data and intelligence organisation. Let's talk more about South Africa and protests, especially their violent nature often. To discuss this, I'm joined by local government expert Paul Berkowitz. Paul, a very good evening to you. Thank you for being on Nightline. So, are violent demonstrations the main language that both government and other authorities at universities, for example, as is going on at UKZN, understand?
Thembekile, it seems to be that way, at least historically. And as you mentioned, the research done by Municipal IQ has found that there was a big lead-up. In the lead-up to the 2019 elections, there was a spike or an increase in service delivery protests, but in the last year and a half, there's been a bit of a decrease. And we know that historically there's a couple of trends that feed into service delivery protests, but you're quite right in that violence has been the language that has galvanized government. Often these protests take place after the normal diplomatic channels, less violent channels, have been exhausted. So people will arrange a meeting with the mayor or the municipal manager or their ward councillor, and when promises are not kept or people feel they're not being heard, sometimes they resort to violence.
Tell me if you agree with this, Paul. Is part of the problem not that in South Africa, be it government and perhaps even some of the scholars and the media in particular, we treat protests as more of an event than something that needs to be understood beyond people blocking a particular road on Wednesday, the 5th of Feb 2020?
It's a very good point, Thembekile. And it also feeds into, when you come to the analysis side, how do you measure the level of protest? Because as you've said, if a community marches peacefully for 5 days in a row and then a protest turns violent on the 6th day, do you record that as one event? Do you look at it as 6 different protests? But you're quite right, it's the violence that catches the headlines, that gets the reporters on site, and that's quite a worrying trend.
And to what extent then does the lack of consequences, some would say, fuel an increasingly violent trend in South African protests?
There are a couple of other trends and developments that feed into the whole service delivery protest phenomenon, Thembekile. The one is that there is sometimes a criminal element that attaches itself, that's opportunistic, that sees there's a legitimate protest and then joins the protest maybe and looks for an opportunity to loot. And it's very hard, if you're not doing the research long-term or you're there on the ground, to tease out who has a legitimate grievance and who's just there because they can exploit the situation. There was a lead-up in service delivery protests around the elections, and part of that is connected to the jockeying of positions at ward level, at local level, and that's also a trend that feeds into the overall service delivery protest phenomenon. And what we've also seen in development in recent weeks, at least this year, is that some communities are actually bypassing the service delivery protest choice or channel, and they're actually going straight into bypassing government. So we've seen that in Makana with Grahamstown and Irini, where different community organizations have banded together to actually take the municipal council to court. Sometimes we've seen it in other municipalities where an alternate private service delivery operator is put in place where people pay money to a private service delivery agency to provide the basic services that they're not getting from government.
But that to an extent then lets the government and whoever the authority is in the particular area off the hook, doesn't it?
It does in that case, Thembekile, but you also, if you're a community, sometimes you're looking for the best solution. Unfortunately, we've seen cases, as you said, in Kwakwa, in Makana, in Enoch, Gijima, where people are without water or sanitation for more than a week. So they can't wait any longer for government to address their grievances, and they look for alternate ways of getting service delivery.
And we're going into a municipal election, this in 2021, with the beginning of 2020. I was saying, coming into the conversation, that the number of demonstrations in 2019 was down from 2018. Are we going to see a downward trend, do you expect, or will it, as in previous election cycles, begin to peak?
If the previous election cycles are anything to go by, Thembekile, if 2016, because we did see a spike in the year 2014 and into 2015, if 2019 is anything to go by, we will see an increase. That's the concern.
All right. How do we get ahead of the many problems that lead people to protest, even if it's not violently? Is it that councillors, government and other authorities are not speaking enough to people? Is it that they're blind to the issues?
I don't think they're blind to the issues, Thembekile. I think it is the first point that if communities feel that their grievances are taken seriously, if they take a memorandum to the mayor and there's action, if they're acknowledged in council meetings, if the issues are raised, if they think that things are getting resolved through the normal channels, then we would be less likely to see service delivery protests. But we also, another trend that I didn't mention is that, and this is borne out by the Municipal IQ research, is that service delivery protests tend to be concentrated in metros, in informal settlements, in areas where there's a big in-migration of people into an area. So a lot of people move from Limpopo into Gauteng, into various communities and informal settlements. A lot of people move from Eastern Cape to Western Cape. And the paradox...
But that's also to do with the centralization of economic resources and infrastructure.
Exactly. And that's a bit of a paradox, is that the municipalities which on paper or on aggregate are doing well are the ones where we see a lot of service delivery protests, because the expectations are increased. There's a lot of people competing for fewer resources, jobs, basic services, and informal settlements are typically underserviced. And sometimes informal settlement population can mushroom, and that places a huge pressure on service delivery.